Okay, let's get into it. For this deep dive, we are looking at a body of source material that, and there's no other way to put this, presents a highly unconventional historical perspective.
That's probably the understatement of the year. It's a view you are just not going to find in, your standard textbook or academic journal.
Absolutely. The material we're examining is drawn from an article by a Stephen A. Raper, and it claims to be a detailed look at the German concentration camp system, but one that offers a far different picture from what we've been told.
And that different picture is really centered on the administration, the rules, the stated intent of the system.
Right. The source makes the case that if you look at the official documents, the system was really designed for reform, not torture and repression.
And it asks the reader to set aside what it calls the hysteria, often associated with the subject.
So our mission here, and we need to be very clear about this, is to distill the core arguments and the specific details that are presented within this source material. We're not judging it, we're mapping its logic.
Exactly. We're looking at how it builds its case. And that case is that the German system of imprisonment was fundamentally designed for rehabilitation, that the camps served, and this is a direct quote, a positive role in the National Socialist state.
And it all builds to this one incredibly challenging claim that anchors the entire piece.
Which is that the German system was, structurally and administratively speaking, probably better in many ways than the American prison system today.
An immense claim.
Mm-hmm.
So our job is to analyze how the source uses its chosen evidence, its selection of documents, of quotes, of anecdotes, to try and justify that very comparison.
Yes. We're dissecting the internal logic of this specific, and I think it's fair to say, very controversial narrative. Let's start where the source starts, with the initial rationale for internment.
What's really interesting about the source's framing is that it doesn't begin with a Nazi official or a party document. It starts with a critic.
A very specific one. A former inmate, a socialist critic named Paul Rassinier.
And Rassinier was actually interned in the camps.
He was. And the source leans very heavily on his 1948 work, Crossing the Line. Because Rassinier is quoted as saying something that, in this context, is revolutionary.
Which is?
That he saw the camps as a gesture of compassion.
A gesture of compassion? That seems like a complete contradiction. Compassion for who? How does the source even begin to explain that?
It explains it with a two-part argument. First, Rassinier supposedly suggested it was just pragmatic. The inmates were put where they could not hurt the new regime. Simple political neutralization.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of cold logistical sense, but that's not compassion.
Right. The compassion part, according to the source, comes from Rassinier's second point, that the camps were also there to protect these antisocial elements from the public anger.
Wait, so the argument is the camps were protective bubbles, not punishment centers imposed by the state, but isolation chambers to shield political opponents from a vengeful population.
That is precisely the argument the source puts forward. It completely reframes the state's motivation.
And once that idea of protection is established, the source moves on to the more active goal.
Yes, the secondary goal, to rehabilitate the strayed sheep and bring them back into what it calls a healthier concept of the German community. It's state-mandated social engineering.
Okay, if the premise is rehabilitation, then who exactly were these strayed sheep? The source is very specific about the categories, isn't it?
Extremely specific. It goes way beyond just political opponents. Of course, you have the obvious ones, people condemned for treason, Communist Party officials, anyone inciting others to refuse military service.
The clear and present dangers to the new regime.
Exactly. But then the definition just explodes outwards into social conduct. The source uses this umbrella term, antisocial malefactors.
And how is that defined?
The key metric was habitual criminality. Specifically, anyone sentenced to at least 6 months of prison or hard labor on 3 separate occasions. So recidivism was the trigger.
But inside that group, it gets even more granular.
Oh, absolutely. The source explicitly lists beggars, prostitutes, homosexuals, drunkards, psychopaths, and lunatics. People who were seen as social outcasts.
So the logic presented here is that the camps were meant to correct not just political deviation, but also moral and social deviation.
That's the core of it. And it goes even further with the category of the work shy.
This one is fascinating. It's a completely different kind of crime, defined directly by Heinrich Himmler.
And his definition was very precise. It was any unemployed man who could be proved to have refused without adequate reason employment offered to them on 2 occasions.
So it's not just about being unemployed, it's about being willfully unemployed. It's framed as a moral feeling.
Exactly, a moral failing that required state correction. So you see how the source builds this picture of a system designed for total social and political reengineering.
And the genesis of the camps, according to this material, wasn't some grand premeditated plan. It was a reaction to chaos.
Yes. The first wave of arrests after Hitler took power was supposedly fueled by denunciations from, fellow workers, neighbors, people who were genuinely concerned about communist subversion, a kind of grassroots panic.
And the scale of that was just overwhelming.
Completely. The source says over 10,000 communists were reported and arrested in just March and April of 1933. The local jails were instantly flooded. They had no capacity.
So a logistical crisis.
A crisis. And the solution, according to the source, was improvisation. Local officials just started taking over abandoned warehouses, old factories, anywhere they could find to hold people.
And these are what the source calls the wild concentration camps.
Yes. And that context is key to the source's argument because it suggests the system's growth was a chaotic, ad hoc response to a security problem, not some pre-planned machine of extermination.
The source then makes a very pointed claim about the name itself, concentration camp.
It does. It claims Hitler stated he got the idea, or at least the terminology, from the British concentration camps during the Boer War in South Africa.
Which is a very deliberate rhetorical move.
It is, because the source immediately draws a sharp contrast. It notes that the British concentrated Dutch women and children. And then it claims over 26,000 of them died, mainly of starvation, because the British made no effort to feed them.
So the argument is what? That establishment historians ignore this fact while focusing on the German camps.
Precisely. It's an attempt to neutralize the term concentration camp by linking it to a non-German event where, according to the source, non-combatants died from neglect. It tries to strip the term of its unique association with the National Socialist regime.
So the argument is that concentration as a concept was about isolation, not necessarily organized killing.
That's the narrative function of that comparison. And it serves as the bridge from those chaotic wild camps to the establishment of an organized, structured system.
Which brings us to the model they developed at Dachau.
Right. The first official camp, established March 22, 1933, near Munich, in an old gunpowder factory.
And the source really emphasizes the public nature of its creation.
It does. It claims the Germans were not ashamed of it. To prove the point, it notes that Himmler held a press conference 2 days before it opened, and the news was carried in German papers.
So it's presented as a legitimate tool of government, not something hidden away. A deterrent.
A deterrent, yes. It opened with just 200 communists, but was built to hold 5,000. And this leads right into the source's description of Himmler's personal vision for the camps.
Which was about being proactive, right, not waiting for crimes.
Exactly. He pledged to ruthlessly pursue and isolate professional criminals to protect the public. But more than just locking them up, the source stresses Himmler's insistence that the camps be models of cleanliness, order, and instruction.
That word instruction is key to the whole re-education argument.
It's the foundation. The stated goal was re-education for minor criminals and communists through things like trade work and vocational training. It's all framed as pedagogy.
And this is summed up in the official camp motto.
Which is pretty revealing. There is one way to freedom. Its milestones are obedience, zeal, honesty, order, cleanliness, temperance, truth, sense of sacrifice, and love for the fatherland.
If you look at those words, they're not just about political compliance.
Not at all. The source argues they represent a curriculum for citizenship, a total moral and social overhaul based on what it calls traditional Aryan virtues: hard work, discipline, law and order, family, respect for society.
And to give this idea credibility, the source brings in an outside observer.
Yes, a correspondent from the New York Times who visited Dachau shortly after it opened.
And what was his impression, according to the article?
The source claims the correspondent came away believing that the commandant, Theodor Eicke, and his men saw their task as pedagogic rather than punitive. He supposedly wrote that they honestly and sincerely believed they were helping the misguided non-Nazis.
So the source uses that outside view to claim that the public mission statement was also the genuine internal belief.
And that this belief was codified in official documents. It cites a 1934 Gestapo document stating that National Socialist Germany would only be complete when its opponents learned to support it.
And that document apparently emphasized the Educational value and ideological indoctrination of the camps.
Yes, with the explicit goal that inmates could return as full members of German society. This suggests a process of reentry was part of the plan from the beginning.
And there's more evidence for that, right? A warning issued to local authorities.
There is. The source mentions a subsequent Gestapo warning telling state authorities not to harass inmates who had been released. The stated reason was that it would make their reintegration difficult.
This is all part of the source's argument that the term education camps, which the Germans themselves apparently used, was a reflection of actual policy.
And it argues this policy continued well into the war. It points to a 1942 letter from Himmler to Oswald Pohl, where re-education is still being stressed.
Even in 1942, with the war in full swing.
Even then, the source claims that instructions to the guards still told them to make their personal behavior an example for the prisoners, to teach them respect for the state and proper behavior.
So the argument is that the entire system, from top to bottom, from 1933 to 1942, was conceptually designed as a pedagogical institution.
That is the core argument the source presents. A system for reform with reintegration as the ultimate goal.
Okay, if the official policy was reform, then the issue of internal discipline is, well, it's critical. How does the source handle the question of guard brutality?
It makes a very strong claim that strict rules against cruelty were maintained, and that staff were systematically punished for breaking them.
Because arbitrary violence would completely undermine the goal of re-education.
Exactly. And the source provides specific examples. It quotes from a guard training manual where a question and answer section explicitly forbids a guard from striking a prisoner at his own initiative outside the framework of the disciplinary regulations.
So punishment was allowed, but it had to be regulated. It couldn't be personal.
That's the idea. And it reinforces this with statements from the top. It cites Reinhard Heydrich in 1935, warning interrogators not to insult a prisoner, demean him, or behave with rudeness, and brutalize or torture him when there is no need to do so.
And he added a threat to that, didn't he?
A very specific one. Guards who beat prisoners would face court-martial. The source uses this to show the rules had teeth.
And Ike, the architect of the system, said something similar.
Yes, in 1937. He stated that guards must abstain from mistreating prisoners and that even a single slap would be considered an act of brutality and the guard will be punished.
So the policy on paper was clear, but does the source claim it was enforced?
It does. This is a crucial point in its argument. It claims the SS tried over 700 staff members throughout the Third Reich for their conduct toward inmates.
700. That's a significant number.
It's the number the source uses to argue that the system took its own rules seriously.
And it highlights a couple of very high-profile cases.
2 camp commandants, Adam Grunwald and Karl Schmilucci. Both were apparently found guilty and punished for the deaths of prisoners that resulted from brutality.
So the source's argument is that these prosecutions prove the SS held its own people accountable.
Yes, that while the number of staff was vast, the punishment of these 700 shows that the leadership expected the majority to adhere to the rules and act as role models for the inmates.
Let's turn to the camp structure itself. The source describes a very organized, almost corporate administration.
Highly compartmentalized. You had departments for administration, health and sanitation, the kitchen, transport, communications, even a legal officer and an education officer.
The presence of an education officer is obviously a key detail for the source's argument.
Absolutely. And the commandants themselves were supposedly held personally responsible for the re-education mandate, at least for prisoners who weren't considered lost cases.
But there was one department that operated separately, right?
Yes, the political department.
Okay.
The source describes it as an extension of the Gestapo inside the camp, run by a secret police officer.
And what was its role?
It was the administrative heart of the incarceration process. It handled reception registration, pictures, fingerprints, and also the paperwork for release.
So cradle to grave, administratively speaking.
And everything in between.
Hmm.
Death notices, correspondence with relatives about things like guardianship or insurance claims, interrogations, censorship. It was a police and records bureau, all in one.
This level of bureaucracy leads to what the source presents as its smoking gun, a document that it claims reveals the true nature of the system.
Himmler's secret memo from May 1942.
Secret, and sent only to senior Gestapo officers. What's so important about it?
According to the source, it reveals 2 things. First, how seriously the leadership viewed concentration camp imprisonment, and second, the origin of what the source calls Allied propaganda.
Okay, so what was the warning Himmler issued in this memo?
He told his officers to stop threatening ordinary citizens with the concentration camps for minor infractions, like not producing a form on time. He was worried the threat would lose its power, that it would become so common that it would breed disrespect for the state's authority.
And what did he say about the punishment itself?
This is the core statement for the source. Himmler wrote that imprisonment in a concentration camp, which he defined as separation from family, isolation, and hard labor, is the most severe of punishments. And he specified it was reserved exclusively for the secret police to use under very precise regulations.
So how does the source use this memo to support its narrative?
It argues first that Himmler's concern for family separation shows the leadership did have some concern for the prisoners. But more importantly, it claims the memo reveals where the bad press came from.
From low-level officials overstepping their authority.
Exactly. The source's argument is that minor bureaucrats were throwing around this threat improperly, which gave the false impression that the camps were a tool of general arbitrary terror against the public, rather than the regulated re-education centers it claims they were.
It's a very sophisticated argument that the system's reputation was ruined by unauthorized overreach, which was then amplified by Allied propaganda.
Yes. And the source tries to counter this false impression by arguing the camps were actually accepted, even accessible, to the German public.
How so?
Well, it claims they were frequently discussed in German newspapers, reporting on the internment of dangerous criminals, suggesting a level of transparency.
And it claims they were open for inspection.
It does. It lists foreign diplomats, German civilians, judges, lawyers, clergy, even social workers as people who were allowed to visit.
The implication being that if things were truly horrific, a decent people, as the source calls them, would have found out and been outraged.
That's the rhetorical question it poses, and it backs this up with an anecdote from a book by Werner Schaefer.
The one about the rebelling children.
That's the one. It claims some local citizens actually asked for permission to send their unruly children to the camps to learn some self-discipline. The source presents this as the ultimate proof of public acceptance of the camp's rehabilitative function.
Moving on to what the source calls prisoner welfare and social benefits. This is where some of the most unique claims are made.
They really are. The source's number one piece of evidence for the reform mandate is the fact that people were constantly being released.
Tens of thousands of them, even communists.
And crucially, these releases were still happening as late as October 1944. The source's argument is simple. If the goal was extermination, why would you keep letting people go?
And it gives a very detailed example of this process with Hitler's 50th birthday pardon in 1939.
Yes, the pardon criteria are used to show a highly bureaucratic, almost judicial process at work.
Let's run through them. Who was eligible?
Well, you had repeat offenders arrested early on who had served at least a year, political and white-collar criminals with minor offenses who'd served 6 months.
So it was tied to time served and the severity of the crime?
It was. It also included prisoners over 60, even Jehovah's Witnesses who refused loyalty oaths. And it covered social categories like first-time homosexuals, as long as they weren't convicted of crimes involving minors.
The source uses these complex rules to argue for a system that was carefully managing its population, not just warehousing them.
And it details the living and working conditions as well. By 1938, a formalized workday. 9 hours on weekdays, 4.5 on Saturday morning.
And the source emphasizes the downtime.
It does. Saturday afternoons and all of Sunday were free time for Christian inmates to attend services and, contemplate their situation. It presents this as proof against the idea of constant, unceasing labor.
And later, in 1941, the system was refined even more.
That's when the camps were classified into 4 groups based on discipline severity. The source claims conditions were eased for minor offenders who were seen as more easily re-educable, a tiered system.
The source even includes a pretty strange anecdote about prisoners refusing release.
It does. It claims some prisoners said they didn't want to leave because they couldn't remember doing work since the start of the Great Depression.
The purpose of that story is pretty clear.
It's to suggest that for some, the structure and security of the camp was actually preferable to the uncertainty of life outside.
Okay, now we get to the most specific social programs the source claims existed.
Let's start with marriage. The source makes the remarkable claim that while barracks were segregated by sex, prisoners were allowed to marry other prisoners, and the registration was apparently carried out by SS officers.
That's an incredible level of administrative normality inside a prison camp. But the claim about life insurance is even more detailed,
It's extremely specific. The source explains that when someone was incarcerated, they couldn't pay their life insurance premiums, so the policy would lapse.
leaving their family with nothing if they died.
Right. So the source claims the SS set up its own fund to pay the insurance premiums of prisoners for as long as they were incarcerated.
And what was the stated motive for this? Why go to all that trouble?
According to the source, it was done so that the inmates' heirs, their family, their children, could collect the payment if the prisoner died, so that the loved ones wouldn't be overly burdened.
The source is using this detail to argue for a deep institutional concern for the stability of the German family unit.
It's a powerful piece of evidence for its argument. And the final claim about child welfare from 1936 is just as detailed.
This is the case where both parents were incarcerated.
Yes. The source claims the authorities decided the children's welfare was more important than maximum security, so they implemented a policy of releasing the parents on a rotating monthly basis.
Rotating, so one would be out while the other was in.
Exactly. To ensure at least one parent was always home with the children, and this would continue until one of them was permanently released.
And the source acknowledges the security risk involved.
It does, but it states emphatically that, in this case, Hitler prioritized the welfare of German children over all else.
These claims, marriage, life insurance, rotating parental release, these are really the capstone of the source's argument, aren't they?
They are. They're used to paint a picture of a system that, far from being a brutal machine, was fundamentally concerned with social order, family stability, and the eventual reintegration of its prisoners.
A system whose administrative machinery, according to this very specific source material, was designed to be corrective and even benevolent.
That is the narrative it meticulously constructs, detail by administrative detail.
So if we pull all this together, the source presents a coherent, if, as we've said, highly controversial narrative.
It's a complete reinterpretation. The camps are seen as administrative tools for rehabilitation, with strict discipline, yes, but also with social supports and clear paths to freedom.
A system where, the source argues, conditions were in some cases actually better than what German civilians faced late in the war.
And this all leads to its explanation for the horrific scenes at liberation. The source asserts that the devastation, the starvation, the disease was caused by external factors. The collapse of supply lines, typhus epidemics, a total breakdown of sanitation because of the war.
So not the result of an official policy of extermination or brutality.
Exactly. The source's argument is that the system was designed to be educational and restorative. Its failures, in this view, were the result of the chaos of war, not a flaw in its original intent.
Which brings us to a final question for you, the learner, drawn directly from the evidence this source presents.
The source makes a very strong case for internal accountability. It stresses that the SS prosecuted over 700 of its own staff for brutality, citing the punishment of Commandants Grunwald and Schmidlsky as absolute proof.
And the stated policy was that even a slap was a punishable offense. If we take the source's claims at face value, that suggests an incredibly rigid dedication to a non-brutal official policy.
So the question we leave you with is this. If a governing body sets up a system based on re-education, and that body actively prosecutes hundreds of its own officers for crimes against the inmates, thereby admitting its own internal failures, how does that documented commitment to punishing unauthorized brutality complicate the narrative about the system's true purpose?
What does this system of internal justice reveal, according to the source, about the gap between official policy and on-the-ground reality, especially when you consider it alongside Himmler's secret memo, which warned against the unauthorized use of the concentration camp threat? It forces you to really examine the source's core assertion that the official rule was always discipline, not death.